a special military operation.
So NATO has accused Moscow of escalating its war on Ukraine after Kremlin allies in occupied territories have announced referendums to join Russia, and the country's parliament approved legislation that clears the way for military mobilisation so they could draft citizens into...
Got two things to say about that, but let's do the referendums bit first.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do, Simon.
Sorry, mate.
Yeah, don't worry. I've prepared something to say about this. But yeah, I mean, basically they're rushing through these sham referendums in places that they've occupied in the east, in Donetsk and Luhansk.
Yeah. Thank God we've never been involved in a sham referendum.
Don't bring that nonsense.
That was the will of the people.
It's the one place where we're dry on.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to make one happen in Scotland, but possibly with Russian interference. But anyway, but basically, he's trying to put these referendums through, and make them ostensibly Russian territory.
Yeah.
And
so, what's your feeling? Is it a sham? Is it, or is it actually likely to expose that there is some support in the demographic?
Well, funnily enough, there is some support in some of these places for Russia, and there's certainly some antipathy towards Ukraine and towards Kyiv, who as well as being seen as distant.
Russia,
yeah, exactly. And they see Ukraine as having forced this war to happen, but that doesn't mean that Putin's right to go in there and seize this land. So and it's really a sort of Putin's desperate because he could be about to militarily lose these areas as he has in the north and the east, and it also changes the legal aspects of this land. It become Russian territory, so any attack by Ukraine wouldn't be liberating Ukraine's land; it would be attacking Russian's land, which would then ostensibly give him the sort of the excuse to escalate and use battlefield nukes. But it's interesting, the influence. This war, and the way it's going for Putin, it's going very badly for Putin, and it's reduced his influence in former Soviet states who are now fighting amongst each other.
It's not a war; it's a special operation.
Special operation.
But it could become a war at this point.
We can rename
it.
Claudia Webb calls it a far right white English football hooliganism.
Well, I think there is some argument for that as well. The interesting thing, though, I've been reading about the mobilisation, not a huge amount, but I just saw this fairly well-informed Twitter thread. But I hadn't really considered this before. If under the Soviet Union, they maintained the infrastructure into which they could pour the conscripted forces at a moment's notice.
Yeah.
But that is not cheap, to maintain officers, to maintain barracks, to maintain the supply chains. These things are extraordinarily expensive to maintain. And as soon as they became Russia rather than the Soviet Union, that was all got away with. So the idea that they can just mobilise... Yeah. Conscripting young men is the easy part. How do you get them out there? How do you train them? How do you determine what they to go to?
But also it would lead to... I mean, the one thing that Putin's still succeeding at is domestic suppression. So he's really quelled any sort of demonstrations. But I mean, if mothers start seeing their sons being sent out, it's going to... It hasn't really affected the Russian public so much yet. I mean, obviously there's some the economy is sort of not doing as well as it would. But if they start seeing their sons being conscripted and sent out there and sent back in body bags, that's going to really affect the public.
One of the other very dangerous things in Russia, of course, is just walking down the street and an oligarch landing on your head.
Yeah,
oligarch
falls out of a hospital window.
Yeah. Don't walk too close to hospitals.
There's quite a few of them. Have you seen the list? I mean, it's an amazing amount of...
It's extraordinary. I don't want to say you have to admire his chutzpah, but there is something quite medieval about his approach to some of these little internal divisions. Well, I mean, what is your feeling? Is it 6 months, 9 months, I guess this war has been going on now? 7, 8, 9 months? I'm trying to remember. It was like late February, wasn't it? We were really braced for... We were all going, well, let's be honest, plucky Ukraine, but it's... I mean, we've all been wrong-footed, haven't we? Is that...
Well, I think isn't it sort of like all of the other similar things where somebody has invaded somebody else's land?
Yeah.
They don't work out very well because people, when they're in their own country, fight much harder than they do when they're meeting up somewhere else.
It's clearly really easy to underestimate, isn't it? I mean, Putin's no...
It's an ideological difference as well because, I mean, the whole Russian autocracy is a command-led structure. So, you can't do anything. If you do anything, you'll get into trouble if it's not what you've been told to do. It's like working for Haringey Council. So the Ukrainian people are fighting with much more mobility and agility and as autonomous units. So it's really the difference between Western liberal democracy and an autocratic regime. We're seeing autocratic regimes calcifying under the weight of their own sort of command structures. You're seeing it in China right now, and it's actually given me a bit of hope that Western liberal democracy isn't over. I think the only threat to Western liberal democracy comes from within us.